From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. In Texas, as floodwaters recede and the death toll slowly rises, a furious political storm is brewing.
People have questions about this. Some critics are blaming DOGE cuts to the National Weather Service for putting those lives at risk.
With over 100 dead and many still missing, residents want to know who is to blame.
In light of the floods, do you think that the federal government needs to hire back any of the meteorologists who were fired in the last few months?
I wouldn't know that. I really wouldn't. I would think not.
Was there ample warning?
Well, 2 investigators has been digging into why Kerr County does not have a flood warning system in place, even though the area is known as Flash Flood Alley.
And why were lessons not learned after a near-identical tragedy almost 40 years ago?
All 4 of my kids were there, and so we lost 2, and we got 2 back, so there's an empty spot in my life, a big one.
The story today. Could the deaths in the Texas floods have been prevented?
I'm Lara Spirit, and I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C., where I'm a Washington correspondent for The Times and Sunday Times.
We had on Friday, Lara, those awful flash floods that many people might have seen, some of the quite grim pictures and news coming out of. Many people dead, many at time of recording still missing, including children. Explain for us where in the world we're talking about.
These devastating floods were in central Texas, particularly Texas Hill Country. This is a part of the world, and particularly of the US, which is not unknown to have seen natural disasters, floods like this in the worst affected areas. This is actually known as Flash Flood Alley. So it has long been known that this is something that is a risk for those who live here, and indeed officials have been talking for many years about the best ways to respond to threats like this.
And why is it so bad for flash floods, that part of the world?
It's shallow soil, and then you have particular flashpoints. So the massive Guadalupe River, which of course was where Camp Mystic, that all-Christian girls' camp, was sat right beside. And as a result of that, you do have these particular flashpoints, particularly for campers. And this was one of the worst possible times because, of course, Luke, it was the 4th of July weekend, a big weekend of celebration where everybody pours out of the cities and into places where they can camp, where they can be near water. And that meant that there were some people in this area as well who weren't familiar with the fact that it was a flood risk.
And to add on top of that, this was even a particularly bad flood, even for an area where flooding is a risk.
Yes, we should say this is unusual. This is not something that normally happens in this place, even if it is more at risk of a disaster like this. So the riverbed rose more than 26 foot in just 45 minutes. That's the worst flooding in 40 years. So it's certainly not normal for this area, even if there are risks of flooding.
What happened 40 years ago?
Yeah, so there was an identical tragedy, or a nearly identical tragedy rather, in 1987 when 10 campers died, and that was at Pot of Gold, a Christian camp in Comfort in Texas, which was about an hour's drive away from the worst affected areas in this case.
It happened when a caravan of buses was trying to escape from a church camp through a low water crossing after an overnight storm.
The vehicles that they were in got swept away, and that was by the same river overflowing.
33 people were plucked from the river and lived, but 10 teenagers drowned. Their names inscribed in a memorial plaque near the river today.
And we'll discuss in a minute about why maybe lessons haven't been learned or what could have been different. But in terms of the actual flood we saw on Friday, just take us through what actually happened. When did anyone first realise that something was afoot?
So there were warnings.
Beginning a week ago, last Sunday, the National Weather Service in San Antonio talked about the potential for heavy rain by the end of the week. Again,
and what we call flood watches through the night on Thursday And on Friday,
flood potential was mentioned, again, specifically in the Hill Country. And then by
culminating in a full flood alert at 1 a.m. on Friday. And of course, the worst of the flooding was in the pre-dawn of Friday when many people were sleeping.
And when you say flood alert, what does that actually mean? If I'm in the area, how am I alerted?
Well, that's a very good question, because if you are in Kentucky and there's a risk of a tornado, you would probably be alerted by a blaring siren, for example, something extremely conspicuous and potentially unavoidable in their home. If you are in Central Texas at a moment like this, you are more likely to be awoken by a notification on your phone that is telling you that there is a high risk of a flood, or indeed at this point, there is catastrophic flooding that's very likely and you need to evacuate. So this is one of the great flashpoints around the response to this, which is whether or not this is an adequate flood warning system. It's clearly not a substantial flood warning system, given that there are witness accounts of people sleeping through it and being woken by neighbours banging on their doors and then checking their phone and seeing that they had an alert like this that was telling them to move on to higher ground because of the risk of flooding.
So these warnings, adequate or otherwise, started coming through in the early hours of Friday. And one of the worst hit places was this Camp Mystic. What is that? What do we know about that?
Yeah, so this is a private Christian summer camp for girls that's right by the river.
Just be like, welcome to camp. Are you ready for camp?
And it's big, so there are hundreds and hundreds of girls that will attend this. It's seen as an annual rite of passage for many children, particularly of the Texan elite.
Here's some thoughts? Yeah, pick me next time for the GoPro. Look at my resume. I have a YouTube channel. Check me out.
There are, the descendants of Lyndon B. Johnson who have gone to this. Laura Bush was a counsellor as well. So it's extremely well known and beloved to people, particularly in Central Texas, but really in Christian communities across the country. And if you look at some of the website for this camp, or indeed listen to some of the testimonials, clearly was a pretty idyllic place for many of these girls.
My favorite part about Camp Mystic is that you get to get away from life with no social media, no phones.
They'd be on canoes across the green water. There would be these log cabins as well. There would be evenings where they would sit by the firelight, by the cypress trees.
And you just get to meet new friends, meet new people, have fun through new activities, and plus you get to eat really amazing food.
This is certainly a particularly devastating place for something like this to happen, and indeed reporters in the US are saying that it's one of the deadliest events for children in many, many years in the US.
The death toll from the weekend flooding in Central Texas has risen to 104 people now.
In Kirk County, the most devastated area, at least 40 adults and 28 children have died.
At least 10 girls from Camp Mystic, they are still missing.
So quite rightly, lots of people are saying, how on earth could this happen in a place like that where they're meant to be people looking after kids and, floods to a certain extent are to be expected? Is it clear at this point why it was a surprise to so many people that this was happening?
The timing of this is obviously one of the reasons why the warnings were so difficult to communicate, right? Like this was something, and this is a point that President Trump himself has made. Flash flooding, by its very definition, it is implied in its term, happens and escalates extremely quickly.
This was the thing that happened in seconds. Nobody expected it. Nobody saw it. Very talented people are there, and they didn't see it. It's, I guess they said, once in 100 years, they've never seen anything like this.
There are some remarkably striking graphs, and I would encourage listeners to take a look at them, of just how high the level of the river rose in a matter of minutes to just a few short hours, which makes it extremely difficult, even if you are running a near perfect warning system and have perfect forecasting, to make sure that all of these people can be aware of that and to evacuate as quickly as possible.
Were there still questions that maybe the forecasting just wasn't good enough?
So this has been a raging debate since really the worst of this emerged. There are Democrats who are calling for an investigation because they say, look, there have been cuts to the National Weather Service, which of course is the chief forecasting agency in cases like this.
In a letter sent today to the Commerce Department's acting inspector general, Schumer said, quote, "I urge your office to immediately investigate whether the staffing shortfalls at NWS offices in Texas and across the country played a role in exacerbating the impact of this deadly flooding event."
So the Trump administration cut or retired almost 600 employees at the NWS. That's 15% of the workforce as part of that drive to reduce the waste in federal departments.
And when you say cut waste, is that Doge and our friend Elon Musk?
That's our friend Elon Musk and Doge indeed. And I mean, it's not just this, it's also the wider emergency relief landscape in federal government. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, being one of those that's been kind of on the front line of all of this reporting on the cuts.
He's already eliminated one FEMA program the White House believes was wasteful.
That program gave vulnerable communities money for such projects as improving stormwater drainage and hardening their electric grids.
So in January, he signed an executive order that looked at revamping that agency. And he's also spoken before about getting rid of the agency altogether.
How soon do you want to see FEMA eliminated?
So we're going to do it much differently. We think after this, Christy, I'd say after the hurricane season, we'll start phasing
set
it
up
in.
a FEMA council.
Now, that's something on Sunday that he said we can talk about later.
Any questions?
President, are you still planning to phase out FEMA?
Well, FEMA is something we can talk about later, but right now they're busy working, so we'll leave it at that. Go ahead.
But one of the reasons I think why some Democrats instinctively move towards looking at this as a reason is because this has been a long-running conversation about spending in these agencies. That said, and we should be absolutely categorical about this, there is yet no conclusive evidence that forecasting was wrong, or that the forecasters did not do their job properly. In fact, the more evidence that we seem to be getting here is suggesting that actually the problem came much further down the line, that it was not the fact that these forecasters had lost their jobs, or even, I should say, there's an isolated case in one of these two offices that are relevant of one of the kind of coordinator roles being vacant. So the warning coordination meteorologist, I should say, that was vacant in one of the two NWS offices that was responsible for this part of Texas. Even in that case, that particular role is supposed to organise coordination months and weeks in advance of things like this. It's not kind of a frontline role where you would expect it to have an immediate impact. It's much more likely that the significant problems that happened in the emergency response to this happened further down the line. And those are really twofold. So firstly, the fact that there was not an adequate flood warning system that would have included sirens, for example. And that's been a decades-long conversation in this part of Texas about whether or not they could afford something like this.
Yeah, didn't they at one point discuss, should we spend some money on something like that in that area?
Yes, so Rob Kelly, who is the most senior elected official, and he's a Kerr County judge, and that's the worst affected county in this, we should say, said taxpayers won't pay for it. And county officials had looked at upgrading a warning system. So, for example, having sirens, like I've said, exist in some places like Kentucky for tornado risks, but kind of resiled from the cost of that. And there was one commissioner that the New York Times reported that had called it a little extravagant for Kerr County with sirens and such. And without blaming really in any way necessarily these officials, we should also say that they did try and apply for federal money at one point years ago, but that money ended up going to dealing with Hurricane Harvey at the time.
And even the warning system that they had in place where, you know, people get texts, it's not a siren or what have you, it was the case that actually only some residents even got that text. So was there even a full evacuation when this was known that this was happening?
So this is one of the big problems with this, was that some of the alerts about the most life-threatening flooding didn't come until the pre-dawn hours. And even then, if you think about the part of Texas that we're in a remote part of Texas often. We're in areas where mobile reception might have been spotty as well. And there are some reports of campers checking their phone and seeing that they just got a notification and the water already basically being up to their waist by this point. So I think the combined effect of those two things, the delayed notification and the spotty mobile reception, and the lack, I think more significantly it seems at the moment, of a flood monitoring system is more responsible than this current big fight that we're having that doesn't seem to be on the money, which is about whether forecasters were to blame here. And that seems like it's not true. And actually, we did hear from Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, about this.
In the wake of this once-in-a-generation natural disaster, we have seen many falsehoods pushed by Democrats such as Senator Chuck Schumer and some members of the media. Blaming President Trump for these floods is a depraved lie. Despite unprecedented rainfall, the National Weather Service executed timely and precise forecasts and warnings.
And even though Donald Trump, as you said, has been someone who's very critical of the sort of federal emergency response systems in the past, he has pulled the lever on all the money and help that the people of Kirk County can get from the federal government.
Yes, so he said that he's likely to travel to the area on Friday. The only reason he's not going there sooner is because he wanted to give them more time. And indeed, signing that major disaster declaration means that the county will have access to federal funds. It means that individuals will have access to significant compensation as well. So will be a really major help for those who are affected in the weeks and months ahead.
We've got quite far into this conversation without mentioning the C word. Has anyone spoken about climate change, pointed the finger at it, said that is this a problem that, maybe we're not keeping pace with the changing weather systems as the planet's climate changes?
There have been criticisms that, generally speaking, that forecasters perhaps aren't keeping pace with climate change, that this is causing an increasingly greater number of violent storms. But I think in this case, the agency response to this and the fact that we have such a glaring example of, local and state systems and warning systems not being in place, that has proved a much bigger focus in the hours since than this discussion about climate change.
Lara, we're talking about these awful floods in Texas and a lot of the finger pointing that's understandably been happening after we've seen so many lives ruined or lost. We, a few days in now, have heard some incredible stories of people who lost their lives, but also people who survived and can tell a tale of what they saw.
The stories have been really harrowing to listen to. And I think if we focus on Camp Mystic, the all-Christian girls' summer camp that I mentioned before, just the idea of these parents getting this notification, being told in a text that, if they hadn't been messaged, then their child was safe, but just the really, really harrowing and awful wait for the others who did not receive that message. We do have some testimonial now from survivors at the camp. So we heard from Eleanor Lester, who's 13, who attended the camp for 5 summers running. She's a quiet, artistic girl from Austin, which is the state's capital, and she'd just finished crafting a leather-bound journal in the camp's arts barn on the day before the storm hit, and she and 5 other girls in cabin 4 were then awakened at 1:30 a.m. on Friday by the sounds of water pelting the windows and snapping off the branches outside. She said it didn't sound like rain anymore. It was this roar, like an animal. I looked out and the trail was gone, just water.
How was she actually rescued?
So she and her classmates climbed onto the roof in the pouring rain, and when the rescuers arrived, she said that they tied a rope across the bridge for the girls to hold as they walked. The floodwater by this point was up to their knees. She said the camp was completely destroyed. It was really scary, and they were later airlifted out. But her bunkmate, who was an 8-year-old called Hadley Hannah, had left the cabin just minutes earlier. She'd been trying to find her counsellor, but she's not been seen since.
Awful. Why does it seem to be the case that older girls like Eleanor were more likely to be safe?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, more than 700 girls at this camp. It's a big camp, and Eleanor was one of a group of older girls who were held on an elevated ground known as Senior Hill, which was where they were staying. And the younger campers were much more likely to be in cabins that were along the riverbank, so the first to be hit by the flood when that river burst its banks.
Has there been any criticism level at the camp about that?
So Bud Bolton, whose daughter escaped the camp, did ask, how do you run a kids' camp on a floodplain and not have a plan? He said there was no warning. Camp Mystic has a statement on its website which says, our hearts are broken alongside our families that are enduring this unimaginable tragedy. We are praying for them constantly. We have been in communication with local and state authorities who are tirelessly deploying extensive resources to search for our missing girls.
And what about the people who weren't so lucky? What do we know about some of the stories of people who perished in all of this?
He died a hero, and that will never dawn unnoticed.
Julian Ryan, who was 27, is one of the most harrowing stories, I think. He died while saving his family.
the early Friday morning hours, floodwater suddenly swelled into the home he shared with his fiancée close to the Guadalupe River.
And it just started pouring in. We had to fight the door to get it closed just so that too much didn't come in.
His fiancée said he punched through a window pane to allow his fiancée, his children, and her mother to escape, and he lacerated his arm in the process and then bled to death before rescuers arrived.
It severed his artery. He looked at me and the kids, and he was like, sorry, I'm not going to make it. I love y'all.
And then we also have some of the stories that are emerging from the girls who lost their lives at Camp Mystic. There is a congressman called Buddy Carter who said on Sunday afternoon that his granddaughters had been at Camp Mystic and that his granddaughter's cousin was Janie, who had died in the floods. And he said, please join me in prayers for Texas. We must ensure that they have the resources they need to find those still missing and save lives.
And of course, it wasn't just this Christian camp which was hit by the floods. The impact was quite broad. What have some of the other survivors in different parts said?
Other Texans spoke of a dramatic race to get out of the path of the flood. Candace Taylor said we had to drive over live power lines to get out of there because the only other way we could go was underwater. So the majority of those who've been killed in the floods are from Kerr County, but like you say, this is something that goes a lot further than just this particular area.
I've lost near friends, best friends, my boss, my godchildren, my house, my car, all those materialistic things, but it's those people that still haven't been found. I'm just praying for their recovery and everyone else affected as well.
Of course, there's a lot to be discussed about what happened and, all of the rescuing and the rest isn't over yet. But I wonder what you think the outcome of all of this will be. Do you think there will be some great reckoning, some change in how that part of the world mitigates this clearly very dangerous risk?
It's so hard, and of course at the time that we're talking there still remain missing girls from the camp, and the operation is still very much in a search and rescue guise. It's not in a recovery mission.
We are doing what's called a primary search, which is basically a very quick search. But when I say quick, that is up, down, sideways. They're turning over as many rocks as they can, culverts up in trees. They are looking at every possible location.
We're not yet in the stage where I suppose we're talking about what the long-term implications will be for disaster response, especially from, as you say, this part of central Texas, which is particularly vulnerable. Indeed, as I'm talking to you, there remain flood warnings and rainfall warnings across many of these areas, so they are far from clear from this risk and the devastation quite yet. But when they are, I'm sure you will see renewed calls for investment in an adequate flood warning system. And you would expect there will be plenty of pressure on state and local officials on this question about investing properly in one going forward.
Lara Spirit, Washington correspondent for The Times. There is plenty more from her and from the rest of the US teams reporting on the Texas floods and the fallout of it at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. You can subscribe to this podcast for free. You can do it right now and you will never miss an episode. That is it from us today. Today's producer was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Edward Drummond, and sound design and theme composition was by Mal Assetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.